You're listening to the Greeks Gridiron. Now here's your host, Ethan Haristadoulou.
Hello again, everybody, and welcome back to the Greeks Gridiron. I'm Ethan Haristadoulou, and today it is that time again to dive into some power rankings following week 3 of the UFL, and as we set our sights on to week number 4. Been sick the last few days, so it took me a little bit longer to get this out to you all, so bear with me if I sound a little nasally or I'm a little bit slower than usual, but we're going worst to first, ranking all 8 teams. Comment down below. Let me hear your thoughts on this past weekend's games, how you would rank all the teams, what are your thoughts on my rankings here. But we'll start from the very bottom and work our way up, and we begin with none other than the number 8 team, the Houston Roughnecks, falling 34-20 in another not so great offensive performance where if it wasn't for Isaiah Henney doing such a great job setting you up field position-wise, I don't think this game ends up being as close as the scoreboard makes it out to look, because it wasn't as close, in my opinion, as that scoreboard made it look. At this point, I think we finally can say we saw the defense collapse just due to the fact that the offense really was not helping you out. And that is kind of something that you run into with football in general. There's always a tipping point where a defense, no matter how good it is, will eventually falter, especially when an offense that they're going up against really gets into rhythm and your offense is just not generating really anything on the other end. They spend more time on the field. Motivation is obviously a factor as well. And I think it kind of came to a head in this matchup here, allowing a league-high 34 points in their loss. That being said, on the offensive side of things, I mean, you're averaging under 17 points per game at this point now, 16.7 if you want to be exact. And like I said, if it wasn't for Isaiah Henney setting you up with something like the 75-yard kick return he had, I mean, if it's not for things like that, this offense feels like it is stuck in neutral. And until running back Mark Thompson can come in and actually play and hopefully be a difference maker for this offense, and you can settle on what it is you're going to do at quarterback and find some sort of rhythm of any kind offensively, this Houston Roughnecks team is the bottom of the barrel, and I don't really see a way for them to climb out of that spot. I don't really know how you could make an argument for anyone else in the UFL right now being at the bottom other than the Houston Roughnecks, and it pains me to say that as somebody who opted to root for the Roughnecks this season, losing my USFL team during the merge, and I don't really know where they're going to go from here. I'll be very curious to see what happens if they're able to make some changes or if anything turns around, maybe find some difference makers or somebody steps up on offense to help lead a charge forward. But right now, this offense is dead in the water, and it feels like we kind of saw the defense break a little bit because of just the struggles that they've been dealing with on the offensive side of the football. And until that changes, I don't really know how this team moves forward in a positive direction. Moving into the number 7 position here, we now have ourselves the Memphis Showboats, who dropped a whopping 4 spots in the power rankings here, going from, I believe I had them at number 3 last week, now down to number 7 at 1 and 2 with a 33-14 loss. Week 2's defensive collapse rolling into week number 3 now, and on top of that, a struggle to maintain drives or just finish drives altogether, and protecting Case Cookus kind of completely flatlines the offense this past week. You allow a whopping 8 sacks and another 8 tackles for loss. The offensive line just looked like it was overwhelmed throughout the entirety of the matchup here, and Birmingham's defensive front, as good as they come, was a literal nightmare for Memphis from start to finish in this matchup here. You also managed just a measly 6 of 14 on third downs, 4 of those third downs ending in sacks. There was just simply nothing Memphis could really do to get into a solid rhythm here. The Birmingham Stallions are a team that are built to overwhelm opponents and do it quickly, whether it's on offense or the defensive side of things, which allows the offense to really start to take over. And if you're not ready for that up front, it's going to be a long 60 minutes for you and a long 4 quarters. But when you look at just like, this is a defense that, coming out of the gates felt like a potential top maybe 3 or at least top half of the league type of defense into this matchup here. I mean, you got like obliterated and reduced to dust. You allowed the season's first 300-yard passer. You allowed a 70% conversion rate on third down. I mean, in my opinion, based off of how teams got divvied up through this merger, Memphis should be just on paper, and games are not won on paper, they're won on the football field. I get that. But just on paper, this Memphis team should not be in the position that they're in. They have way too much talent on both the offensive and defensive side of the football, coupled with the coaching staff that they have working with over there. This team is far too talented to be where they are right now. And for them to come into this game, offense completely flatlined, your defense gets completely obliterated, and you came into this game feeling like a legitimate threat. Like there is a possibility, despite what happened to you last week, that, you could at least bring it to Birmingham, and you got reduced to dust. And basically, you watched the Birmingham Stallions just gallop on past you, pun intended there, and, never really look back. I was very shocked, and now I'm kind of concerned because, again, there's so much talent on this team, but since basically, you honestly could go back to the end of week number 1. You basically, honestly, if you look at this team in a nutshell, for as much talent as they have, you have yet to score more than 19 points on offense. The defense looked really good in weeks 1 and 2, but then kind of collapsed late in week 2 and just flat out was not really available for you, apparently, going into this third game here of the week. There's an issue going on in Memphis right now, and I'm hoping that they can right that issue and move forward in a positive way, but I'm kind of at a loss. This is not where I expected Memphis to be, and again, I just feel like it's way too talented of a team, and maybe there's something that I'm missing and that others are maybe missing, because I know a lot of other people expected a lot from Memphis this year as well. I'll be curious to see what happens with them, but after, a collapse last week and getting blown out of the water this past week, this is kind of where I'm feeling Memphis, at least for the very moment. Moving into number 6, and yes, the other winless team, not sitting in the bottom 2. I have the Arlington Renegades, who fell 29-28. One of the big separators for me is that at least Arlington has been extremely competitive offensively, arguably against every other offense that you have in the UFL right now. Like, they're putting up points in losing games, and yeah, week 1 was tough, but at this point right now, we're kind of looking at Birmingham as like the best above everyone else, and it almost feels like they're in a league of their own right now. So can you really fault them for having a tough performance in the second half? I mean, that's something that we'll have to look at as the season continues to progress and how other teams fare against Birmingham, but it almost feels like you have to take a look at how they fared and you go, well, they played Birmingham. But in the last couple of weeks, the amount of points they've put up on the board, they have been very competitive offensively, and I do think they have one of the more potent offenses in the league. But if you can't stop a nosebleed on defense, you can't expect to win football games. I mean, Luis Perez, 290 yards through the air, a couple of touchdowns. This guy has 6,000 yards passing now in spring ball. He is somebody who can throw the football with the best of them in the spring leagues. Your team racked up another 123 yards and a score on the ground as well. You're averaging 4.1 yards per carry. Wide receiver Tyler Vaughns is emerging now as a legitimate wide receiver 1 in Arlington. He had 9 catches for 109 yards and a touchdown on top of that. He's second in targets right now. He's second in receptions, third in receiving yards. I mean, you have a lot to like about this offense. But none of it matters when your defense is currently the only team with 1,000 yards allowed so far this season. Sitting on 1,000 on the dot. You're allowing nearly 28 points per game. You are tied for the most touchdowns allowed this season. You are allowing 5 yards per carry on the ground. And on top of that, you look at the way they played this game in terms of just discipline as a whole for the entire team. 9 penalties for 75 yards, including a 15-yard roughing the passer that sets you up to ultimately lose this game here on the final, couple of drives of the game. If this defense cannot tighten up, this team is not going to be able to turn this thing around. And it's unfortunate because, again, you have a really good offense over there in Arlington, in my opinion. And I think that this is a team that can take it with the best of them, but they've got to tighten up on defense. They have got to figure it out on defense. If they cannot do so, there's going to be more losses in that loss column than there are wins come season end, and you're already trending in that direction now. Like, we're closing in on the midpoint of the season already. 3 weeks in, heading into week 4. Week 5 is that midpoint, so we're closer to midway than we are the start of the season now, which is a wild thing to already spit out there. But, I mean, you have an 11-point lead, 1:59 on the clock. I mean, you allow a 57-yard return, then 15-yard roughing the passer penalty ultimately sets up a very short field for a touchdown. Then 4th and 12 try. Between that play and the play after, you allowed 45 total yards, which sets up the game-winning field goal. You've got to play tighter than that, especially at those late stages of the game. Those types of things cannot be happening. You can't be losing games where you're up 11 in the final 2 minutes. Like, I know it's the UFL and this way the scoring is kind of designed. It's designed to allow these types of comebacks to happen, but at some point you got to play defense late in these games to finish things off, and Arlington is just not doing that right now. And then to round out the bottom half of the UFL right now, sitting at 2-1, I have the DC Defenders. I will say that this is a 2-1 team that performance-wise kind of doesn't feel like a 2-1 team to me, but they are 2-1. You can't argue against that. The standings do not lie, and the record does not lie as well. But you had a worse defense than what Arlington put up this past week and somehow still managed to pull off a win. And that's kind of why I'm sitting here struggling with where I have DC. But I mean, you look at the other teams behind them, and at this point, I can't really rationalize them to be ahead of DC just based off of wins alone. But I mean, 419 total yards allowed in this game here, 28 points allowed on the evening as well, despite the win. They're basically in a battle for league's worst defense with Arlington. And you can almost say it was like an Arlington Renegades meltdown that helps you get this victory here. I mean, it wasn't a great day for Jordan Te'amu. Yes, he had some choice scrambles that ultimately help you out in certain spots here, but I mean, 11 for 24, like, yes, the 2 touchdowns are nice, but one of those touchdowns comes late, and again, you were kind of gifted some things. It's tough. Your running backs, you know, they manage next to nothing on the ground against the league's worst run defense by a mile. It's not even close. Arlington, by far, league's worst run defense, where your running backs amounted for 29 total yards on the ground, averaging 2.5 yards per carry. You basically banked on massive chunk plays from your receivers in spots where it mattered, and I mean, it ultimately worked out for you. Like, you had 6 players who caught passes for double-digit yardage or more on a singular catch. 3 of those players going for 20-plus yards, 2 of them for 25, if you want to really get into the nitty-gritty of things. But there is, in my opinion right now, a line being drawn between the top and bottom of the UFL, and I feel like DC is where that line is starting to be drawn, and maybe Memphis can turn things around right now. I have so many concerns regarding the offense of Houston and the defense of Arlington that I'm fine with where they are right now, and I wouldn't be shocked if that's where they end, or if maybe Arlington dips back even further if the defensive issues just continue to compound. But it feels like we're getting a little bit of a line drawn in the sand here, where we're starting to see what is real and what is not, and I'll be curious to see how things shake out going like the next couple of weeks here. But I feel pretty confident that we're starting to figure out who's amongst who the better against the rest. Moving into the top half of the league now, though, coming in at number 4 at 2-1, I have the San Antonio Brahmas, and a lot of this just has to do with the fact that you're losing Chase Garbers now with a potential season-ending injury. There's apparently potential he could come back late in the season, but based off of just how good he was for this team, it's a tough blow, and I think enough that it warrants a bit of a drop here. I had them at number 2 going into last week, and now coming here, dropping a couple of spots with the loss now, and a potential loss of your starting quarterback for the entirety of the season, I think is a good reason to knock you down. You have to wonder how much this is going to hurt the offense over there. And I mean, I think a lot of the success from the Brahmas side of things comes down to just how potent their passing attack could be in tough situations. Now you have to look to guys like Quentin Dormady or Tom Flacco, who, curiously enough, Tom Flacco, 3-letter first name, Joe Flacco. Is this Joe Flacco in disguise? Wink, wink. But we have 2 other quarterbacks to look at here in San Antonio to see how they will fare. And even in this game here, it just felt like the passing attack was off rhythm. And I don't necessarily know if that has to do with the injury that Chase Garbers was dealing with, because apparently it happened sometime within the third quarter. And I mean, things were not pretty for a decent amount of the game, but maybe, beyond that injury where it really started to fall apart. I don't really know. I don't want to sit here and speculate on how much the injury did or did not affect him here, but obviously it's enough to knock him out for a while. But I mean, like, you go to like the Jontre Kirkland drop where, that Chase Garbers hit him deep beautifully, and it just ultimately, ball hits the ground here. We've seen some of these inconsistencies with this Brahmas offense the last couple of weeks, and their saving grace really was the fact that their defense has been so good, but even that faltered this weekend as well. I mean, you ultimately allow 31 points when you were, in my opinion, in conversation for top defense in the UFL with Birmingham, but now Birmingham seems to have kind of pulled away with not only the best offense now, but the best defense on top of that. But you lose your starting quarterback, And now the defense, which, coming into this game had only allowed 1 touchdown to this point in the season, allows 3 touchdowns to St. Louis. They're very aggressive. They're not afraid to get after you, but it felt like St. Louis was kind of burning them for that. They were well aware of the aggressive nature that they were coming up against and what San Antonio brings on defense, and they took advantage of it, and they hit them for some really quick plays that, exposed the weaknesses within this San Antonio defense. So I think that there's going to be some trouble brewing for San Antonio going forward right now. This is where, again, that line of like top and bottom starts to blend right now, because where does DC really lie? What is San Antonio going to look like going forward? That's where I really like that. I like the positioning right now that I have with the middle of the pack. Moving into number 3, and I will say I spent the most time trying to decide who I was going to have at number 3 and who I was going to have at number 2, but ultimately I settled on at number 3 with the 2-1 St. Louis Battlehawks, winning 31-24 over the San Antonio Brahmas we were just discussing here. Balance is key for successful offenses, in my opinion. Yes, you can get away with having overly potent passing attacks at times, but you have to be very good at that. But the way I see this offense right now starting to take shape over there in St. Louis, you had 152 yards through the air, 113 yards on the ground now. A.J. McCarron continues to do an excellent job taking care of the football, putting it where it needs to be, not taking these like outlandish risks throwing the football. He even had himself a fun rushing touchdown on top of that. But it's the running backs now. You had Mateo Durant last week hit over the century mark, and now Jacob Saylors looked excellent in week 3 as well for you. You have a legitimate run game starting to brew on top of a litany of pass catchers that you can go to throw the football. And there's a lot to like with what St. Louis has offensively. Now, the defense, in my opinion, I would say jury is still out on it a little bit right now. Your bottom half of the league in terms of points per game allowed. Struggles on third down are apparent as the second worst third down defense, allowing a 50% conversion rate right now. So it's either they're converting or not, basically right down the middle. And you allowed another 100 yards on the ground. So they're sitting currently as the second worst run defense in the league. But they're doing enough to put them into position to win football games as they have the last couple of weeks. I'm excited for them because this is one of those fan bases that, they show up. St. Louis is an exciting team, and it is a team that you want to see do well in spring football with just how big their fan base is and how much of a diehard group they are. But I do have some concerns about that defense, and it's something that I've been talking about, I feel, at length so far for them this season. They looked really good in week 1, struggled last week, and now you kind of saw some struggles again, albeit I would say better of a performance this week than last week overall. But overall, jury's still out on the defense. But offensively, if they can look the way they did this week, very complete unit, ton of talent to work with, a quarterback who knows what to do with the football when you need him to do things. And I think that things are looking good over there in St. Louis. And then moving into number 2, we have ourselves the Michigan Panthers taking a massive leap. I had them at number 5 last week, but after what I saw from them this week, I hammered the table and I said, you know what? I'm going to go with it. I'll maybe have to put a sock in my mouth after making this here, but Michigan Panthers, man, listen, it's time to put some respect on them. They took that 12-11 lead against Houston and basically never looked back. Blew the door open with the Marcus Mims 66-yard touchdown, and Marcus Mims now, who's apparently the best deep threat in spring football at this very point, 9 catches so far on the season, 218 yards. He is averaging 24 yards per reception. That is ludicrous numbers right now. He is second in the league in receiving yards, but he has 9 catches to go with it. That's insanity. On top of that, you have a very just wild rushing attack where you have 2 running backs in Matt Colburn and Wes Hills, who can both be effective running backs when things are going well for them. But then on top of that, you of course have EJ Perry, and there's so much to the rushing attack that you always have to keep your eyes peeled as to like what's going on with what the Panthers are doing on the ground, that it kind of forces defenses to take a step back and almost hesitate with what they're trying to do. And you saw them take advantage of that against Houston in this matchup here. Offensive line took a step in the right direction as well. A lot of people were praising EJ Perry for how much better he looked in this week's game compared to his first couple of games. And while that's fair, I think a lot of his struggles so far this season have had to do with the offensive line, and I've been talking about that. EJ Perry showed us what the high potential upside was that he brought to spring football last season. For those of us that were watching the USFL last year, this is not a surprise. We've been here. We've done this already. We've seen this happen. We saw the spark he brought to Michigan last year. But unfortunately, he only got a 2-week kind of exposure for us all before he ends up going to the NFL for a short little stint on the Jaguars practice squad, wherever it was. He wound up in the NFL for a little bit of time. But now he comes back. Offensive line's doing some soul searching, sorting things out the first couple of weeks. He finally gets really good offensive line play this past week, and things start to really erupt. If you can get more of that in Michigan, this is a team where the offense is varied enough and has enough talent to keep defenses on their heels. But then you have a defense as good as Michigan's being able to come in, wreak havoc up front on the defensive side of things. This is a team that has the makings to be a legitimate threat in the UFL to potentially snag themselves a championship come season end. And one thing I think is worth really pointing to right now, and it's obviously a small sample size right now, but the case will continue to grow for this as the season continues on. Look no further than the way they fared against Birmingham last week. It was a tough loss, a gritty one, 20-13, but they hung on there, and it was close, and they were some better offensive line play away from stealing that game over Birmingham. The other two opponents that have played Birmingham have been absolutely mopped all over the floor by the Stallions. So far, through 3 games, Michigan's the only team that really brought an effort in competitive matchup against the Birmingham Stallions. So I'm curious to see how much that changes over the next few weeks. But Birmingham has 2 blowouts and a tight victory over Michigan. And that's definitely something worth talking about when you consider where Birmingham lies in the standings and hierarchy of spring football right now. And of course, sitting atop them all, as I've already kind of started to praise them, Birmingham Stallions sitting at number 1, the class of the UFL, the class of spring football, and no one truly looks equipped to stop them. Despite how close Michigan was able to keep it last week, it was still a 7-point game. And when you have a team this early in the season, I'm sorry, I'm battling through this voice loss here that I have going on. The defense, this early in the season, being rounded into the form that it is right now, a league-leading 17 sacks. You are 9 sacks above, 8, 7. What is this? I don't know. What's the math on this? 8 sacks ahead of the team that is in second place. You are tied for first in defensive takeaways at 5. You have a league best 3 touchdowns allowed, only 41 points allowed, which is 21 points lower. 3 scores lower than the team that is in second place, and you have the least yards per game allowed at only 226 yards per game so far. It's no surprise that Birmingham is where they are right now. And then an offense where Adrian Martinez came in and basically just took a stranglehold on the quarterback 1 position. At this point, he is going to be the guy, totaling for a whopping 378 yards. He's the league's first 300-yard passer this season, combining for 3 total touchdowns on the day. You had 4 different receivers who managed a play of 30-plus yards against a Memphis Showboats defense that came into that matchup looking pretty threatening based off of the first couple of weeks of the season. Birmingham sits atop of spring football's mountain as the best team in professional football inside of the spring era. That being said, if you disagree, let me know in the comment section down below, but these are my power rankings. It must be fun being a Stallions fan. Let me know how fun it is in the comment section. But as always, if you made it to the end, I greatly appreciate it. I'll catch you all next time. Have a good one.